America has set a precedent for decades that they'll just write the check. But if the will of the people isn't there, everyone needs to step up. Everyone has to do their share. And that includes what's happening here in the Middle East. If we do that collectively, we can get to an answer. But if we default to the old ways of America's just going to be the big idiot with a checkbook, that's not going to work. That's not going to happen. And you saw what happened. When my father starts threatening they're going to pull out, we're not going to do this anymore, because he's listening to the people that elected him to office. The whole world, this is outrageous. It's not outrageous, it's common sense.
Is the son of the President of the United States, the other isn't. Together, well, what I can say is that you probably won't need a cup of coffee. They will keep you engaged and awake. So please welcome Donald Trump Jr. and Omeed Malik and our moderator, Sky's Yalda Hakim.
Thank you, and good morning. Welcome to this session. I know many of you have been eagerly awaiting this particular panel. My guests don't need much of an introduction, but I'm going to give you one anyway. Mr. Donald Trump Jr., partner at 1789 Capital, and Mr. Omeed Malik, founder and CEO of 1789 Capital. And this really is an opportunity to discuss how the economic and political landscape is changing in the United States as well as here in the Middle East, but also a chance to discuss how diplomacy is shaping investment opportunities. I just want to begin with a question to you both about 1789 Capital. The focus is, you know, a sort of America First investment, a MAGA economy. You've called it patriotic capitalism. Could you guys just explain what that means?
Yeah, sure. So first I'll start with the name. 1789 is a year that most people recognize as the French Revolution, where people's heads were cut off. But I feel like, you know, in the United States, for us, it means something different. It's actually the year the Bill of Rights was introduced. And that's central to the way we think about everything. The Bill of Rights is a uniquely American document. It affords us certain protections. Countries similar to us, even like the United Kingdom, do not have a Bill of Rights, by the way. And Don and I came up with the idea for this fund really at the height of the Biden administration. And there were a few things that were going on that concerned us greatly. The first was what we felt was an unholy alliance between the largest corporations, mostly in big tech, with the federal government, in cahoots to basically undermine some of those constitutional protections, namely the First Amendment. Now, you saw this when factual counter-information was being provided around things like COVID and vaccines, and you were shut down. So there was an assault on the First Amendment, and we believed that was at the behest of a federal government under Biden. We were very concerned about that. And at the same time as well, you started seeing other people in the private sector not do anything about it. In fact, in the area we're in, which is venture capital or private investing, just the opposite was occurring. The most prominent venture capital firm at the time is called Sequoia Capital. They went and launched a China-only investment fund. And I like to joke, this is like if in the 80s a fund started a Soviet-only fund. So this was kind of the backdrop into where we found ourselves, and Don and I weren't going to take it. We wanted to do something about it, and so we started 1789.
Is the sort of background to this also driven by this rivalry and competition and threat coming from China?
I think 100%. The world has realized where China stands. I think when you look at the alliances that we're talking about, even on this very stage, countries coming together to solve and major conflicts around the world, I think that's fundamentally important. China has acted as an actor for themselves. I think the number one thing that we've realized over the last 4 years in the prior administration was that a weak America by itself is not just bad for America, it's bad for the entire world. We've seen the conflicts arise, we've seen the wars break out. I think in my father's first 9 months, he solved 7 or 8 wars that, honestly, the average American didn't even know was occurring. He was criticized by many during the primaries for saying all he wants to do is stop the death. Think about that. Criticized for just wanting to stop the death, whether that's Ukraine, Russia, whether that's Gaza, whether it's Thailand, Cambodia, whether it's the stuff in Rwanda. Wasn't that always the most common solution? Wasn't that the holy grail of geopolicy? Getting wars to stop and stopping the death, and yet he was criticized, and we realized he was criticized because there's no money in peace, there's only money in war. And so trying to be the guy that solves that, I guess, puts a target on your back, because a lot of powerful entities have profiteered very much from that. And so we wanted to make sure that we created something that hasn't existed in a while. And we saw that yesterday in the opening ceremonies here. Justice. Justice is a great idea, but it has not been weighed equally. Justice has been weaponized. It has been benefited, to one side only. And a big part of that can't just come from government and governmental entities. We actually have to do that in the private sector as well. One without the other doesn't work. And so that was a big focus of 1789 and what we wanted to do, to fund those companies that exist, that agree with the fundamental tenets of so many of the freedoms that we are afforded as Americans. And we want to make sure that happens for the rest of the world as well.
There's a straight line to the decline of the American middle class with our embrace of China, starting with its entrance in the WTO. And I blame our policymakers more than I blame our Chinese for outsourcing our entire supply chain to a country that's 4 times our size. During the George W. Bush and Obama presidencies, you saw this decline accelerate. And the issue that we have is it's not just the policymakers. They were aided and abetted by corporate America that were willing to do that and outsource all of their activities, and then that undermined the middle class in the United States. This is a period of deterioration, and the policymakers and corporate America, again, who then at the same time were embracing this concept of wokeism and ESG policies that made absolutely no sense to shareholder value. It's now established that it actually destroyed shareholder value. And what else were we doing? Fighting wars and quagmires in the Middle East, where we were spending trillions of dollars unnecessarily. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq got us absolutely nothing. So again, when you talk about further intervention in the Middle East, and again, this is why President Trump won. He was the first to call out China, and he was first to very vocally be against these unnecessary wars. That's why he won. People were sick of it. So if anybody else wants to start another war, the burden is not on us to say no. They have the criminal burden of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt, to do another folly.
In fact, during the campaign, he was accused of perhaps trying to start wars. That was kind of a slogan that many people pushed, his critics.
I mean, it was probably one of the dumbest soundbites in the history of soundbites. But again, when the narrative was controlled by one side, when censorship was running rampant and it was really functioning as the cheerleader for the left, that was ridiculous. I mean, Donald Trump was labeled as the guy that was going to start World War III. Ironically, it wasn't Donald Trump where all these wars started. Russia didn't invade Ukraine under Donald Trump. They did it, under Obama. They did it again under Joe Biden because, again, they understood that feckless leadership in the White House would allow the bad actors of the world to run rampant. That's a story as old as time. Predators prey on the weak, and if America is weak, the predators are going to act. So that great irony that Donald Trump was going to start World War III when he's the only one in modern foreign policy history who's actually solving wars shouldn't be lost on people, and yet it's something that no one's ever going to speak about.
We're going to talk about the Middle East and Ukraine in a moment, but I just want to go back to China because, of course, we know that China dominates and controls the critical minerals. Can America catch up, and how?
100%. We just have to get active. The reality is that the way that China has conducted themselves, especially in Africa as it relates to rare earth minerals, they show up with a briefcase of cash, they pay off someone, they promise jobs, they show up and they bring their own workers. They promise infrastructure. They build it, and 2 years later, it crumbles into the ground, and then they leave, leaving a wake of destruction in their background. I think so many of the African nations have woken up to the way that China behaves, and I think that opens up an opportunity for American companies to go in there. Our mandate is we invest in America, but so many other American companies will go into these areas if they feel that they can actually deal on a fair playing field. That has to be created. We've seen the supply chain crises issues over the years. America can no longer just sit there and hope that China is going to be a good actor and distribute these things around the world. I think the rest of the world also understands that they want America to be at the forefront of all of that because they understand where they stand with China as well.
The entire ethos of 1789 Capital is about the reindustrialization of the United States. So we are totally behind that. Everything we invest in within the United States does one of two things, either enhances the security or prosperity of America. And reindustrialization doesn't mean making the same types of widgets you made 50 years ago for those people who try to undermine our sentiment. In fact, it means winning in the new economy around areas like artificial intelligence that also, I think, have demonstrated that if you outsource your supply chain, you don't have true national security or sovereignty. We saw this very clearly in COVID. If another country produces the most important goods for your country, then you're in trouble. And we could not do anything with the Chinese during that period of time because they were making things like all of our pharmaceuticals. So it's a national imperative for the private sector to step up and start investing in areas like this. And we're doing that at 1789. And the great thing is, during this period, we have an administration who is being very active in supporting that as well.
I want to bring your focus and attention back here to the Middle East. We've just heard from the Qatari Prime Minister, and of course Qatar was pivotal when it came to ceasefire talks in the Middle East, and we saw President Trump's 21 peace point plan that he worked with leaders in this region. But the ceasefire is fragile. Do you think it can be sustained?
I think it can, but I think we also have to recognize what's going on. I mean, I think that was pretty breaking news to find out that both the Israelis and the United States basically asked Qatar to bring in some of these people because you're having talks, not just with nation states, but other actors, whether we agree that they're bad or good, they still have to be a part of that peace process. The fact that Qatar was able to do that, they did that at the behest of the United States and Israel, and didn't say anything as they're being critiqued around the world because they had the objective of actually getting to peace, and rather than throwing your allies under the bus to save some PR headaches, they did that. I want more allies like that. I want more partners like that. Very different than what we've seen from places like perhaps the European Union over the last few years, although we didn't see that much yesterday, but over the last few years where it was like, you know what, I'll get a great soundbite in the media if we critique Trump's plan. Even though our foreign policy experts, and I say experts very loosely because if you're an expert but you haven't been right about anything in about 25 to 50 years, you should likely lose your expert status. That doesn't actually happen. So to have an ally like that that's willing to take those hits because of the greater good, to get to a resolution rather than to solve a PR headache in the day, I mean, I think that's true leadership and should be commended.
We just also heard the Qatari Prime Minister, Tucker, asked him whether, Qatar was going to pay for Israel's destruction, and it was clear that they're not going to. But is the Trump administration, from your perspective, committed to ensuring that there is a reconstruction program? Because there are many who fear that the administration is going to move on pretty quickly and not sort of stay at the long course.
Well, I think without question. I mean, if there's one thing my father is, he's a builder. I know, obviously, he's been in politics for the last decade, but he got there by being a builder, so he understands how to do that. I do also know, though, that he understands that the American public isn't going to do what they used to do for years, where we're just going to be the big dumb guy with the checkbook and we're going to cover all of the world's problems and no one else has to do their part. I think he can be, the greatest construction manager in the history of the world, but no one in America wants to bear the entire responsibility of that. That's happened for far too long. Everyone has their ideas. Everyone wants to do X, Y, Z. When it comes to actually writing a check and breaking out their own checkbook, well, we're not interested in that. That changes things. The American public doesn't have the appetite to fund everything for everyone all over the world with no direct benefit to themselves. So I think he can be the manager that brings that together, but everyone's going to actually have to step up and do their part and not just leave it to the United States to cover everything.
Omeed, do you think that the private sector has a role to play when it comes to, say, the reconstruction of Gaza?
I'm sure. I mean, I think that there'll probably be an opportunity for the private sector, but also there'll be governments that step up and, to help solve this issue. I mean, again, we're here as business people, and our focus is mostly in the United States, though.
I want to focus on Ukraine because, of course, as you say, you're both here in the capacity of business leaders, but you've also been instrumental in shaping the message of the administration. You talked about Europeans, and Europeans are concerned that Ukraine is going to be abandoned. Are those fears valid?
I don't think Ukraine is going to be abandoned, but I think for years, again, it was the same thing as the last answer, which is, well, we want to attack Russia. We want to do this. Well, when it comes to actually writing a check ourselves, no, the U.S. is going to do it. The American public doesn't have an appetite for that. Since the invasion of Ukraine, I heard major leaders, Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate in the United States, saying, it's the #1 issue for Republicans in the United States. And I say, that's weird. I speak to Republicans all over the country every day, probably far more than Mitch has ever spoken to, despite his 379-year career in politics. I did that on a weekly basis, and I surveyed people at every talk I did. It got to the point where it was probably well over 200,000 Americans that I spoke to directly. And I'd be in a room like this, and I'd ask, is Russia-Ukraine a top 3 issue for anyone in the room? Nothing. Is it a top 10 issue for anyone in the room? I think I got 3 people that once said it was a top 10 issue. 3 out of hundreds surveyed, hundreds of thousands, every weekend for 2 years, till basically through the campaign. One person misunderstood the question. He thought it was a double negative. One person was actually from Kiev, so he was like, it was a big deal for him. And the other person was, I think on the board of Raytheon. So there was no appetite for that, but that didn't stop a Republican Party from saying it's the #1 issue. It's not, and we actually have to listen to the will of those people. So we want peace, we want to stop the death, but I even saw that yesterday where, on this very stage, what was the idea for Europe, who is on the border of Ukraine, who has much more at stake if this happens? Well, our plan is to win economically when pressed on the issue. How are you going to do that? Well, we're just going to wait for Russia to go bankrupt. That's not a plan. That's not an idea. The gentleman from Spain was a lovely guy. I saw him last night later on at the forum, but Spain was putting in 2.2% rather than the 5% required by NATO, because my father actually wanted people who are the biggest stakeholders to get into the game. Well, we feel that our 2.2% is being utilized more efficiently, and therefore we're not. That's not an answer. That's not a solution. And again, I understand why they are there, because America has set a precedent for decades that they'll just write the check. But if the will of the people isn't there, everyone needs to step up. Everyone has to do their share. And that includes what's happening here in the Middle East. If we do that collectively, we can get to an answer. But if we default to the old ways of America's just going to be the big idiot with a checkbook, that's not going to work. That's not going to happen. And you saw what happened. When my father starts threatening they're going to pull out, we're not going to do this anymore, because he's listening to the people that elected him to office. The whole world, this is outrageous. It's not outrageous. It's common sense. When we're bombing drug boats in the Caribbean, people who are literally bringing in fentanyl to America, something that kills 100,000 Americans a year. Okay, just for perspective, that's 2 Vietnam Wars a year in America. The neocon establishment, the Democrats, how dare you do this? I mean, that's a far greater, clear and present danger to the United States than anything going on in Ukraine and Russia, and yet they're against it. Think of the insanity of that. So my father has a common sense approach to everything. That's because rather than being a lifelong bureaucrat who's never actually done anything in the real world, he has, and he understands what that means, and we have to act accordingly.
Yeah, so I just want to say one thing on that. Going back to the gentlelady that spoke yesterday, I think she had a Freudian slip, at least I hope it was one, where she talked about what we did to the Russians in Afghanistan. That's not a great comp, by the way. Okay, that's a horrible comp. What we were doing, we're funding a mujahideen that create radicalization in that country, and we know what we reaped after that. I'm a business person, I look at this. We've spent almost $300 billion over there, and now we find out that Zelensky's #2 is under investigation for corruption. Where's the audit of where any of that money went? We should be asking those questions. We have over 300,000 people dead. It doesn't make sense as the United States to have enemies in both Russia, China, and then also add Iran in there. So from a strategic standpoint, again, speaking as a private citizen, my sense is you should act as a reverse Kissinger, neutralize the Russians, and then focus on the real threat that nobody seems to want to talk about except his dad, who started the conversation, that China is the one that you need to focus on.
One of the most amazing things I got to witness, I was this summer with my beautiful girlfriend Bettina in Monaco, and we were driving around, and on an average day, 50% of the supercars, the Bugattis, the Ferraris, all had Ukrainian plates. Do we think that was actually earned in Ukraine? I'd been to Ukraine 20 years ago. It wasn't like there was a plethora of wealth there. And yet, you see the #2 there getting arrested for stealing hundreds of millions of dollars. You hear all the rumors about what's going on. When I see every license plate on a supercar in Monaco being Bugattis, the rich fled. They let what they believed to be the peasant class fight these wars. And there was no incentive to stop, because as long as the money train was coming and they were stealing it and no one was auditing anything, the leaders, the decision makers, there was no reason for them to ever come to peace. No different than Putin. It wasn't the son of oligarchs that were fighting these wars. It's someone from Siberia that they're sending there. And he utilized the war to rebuild his manufacturing base. It was very clear that the sanctions that we put on did nothing to actually help. All it did was jack up the price of oil, which allowed him to basically pay for the war with the delta between the two while building up his manufacturing base. There was no incentive for anyone to ever get to the table. Zelensky knew he wouldn't win another election again, and they were continuing to steal. Putin was building up his manufacturing base, and all we had in the wake was millions of young men dying for nothing.
I mean, obviously, Ukraine has a massive corruption issue, and as you say, they're being
It was a far more corrupt country than Russia, as delegated by the United States government prior to this war. But then, because of the war, and because he's one of the great marketers of all time, Zelensky became a borderline deity, especially to the left, where he could do no wrong. He was beyond reproach. Years of corruption, years of graft and theft on a world stage that everyone in this room knew was happening was totally absolved. And it's ridiculous. We're not dealing in reality.
But is your hunch that President Trump is going to walk away?
I think he may. What's good about my father and what's unique about my father is you don't know what he's going to do. The fact that he's not predictable, he's not following the playbook of every clown who's, again, been a bureaucrat for decades, you don't know. And so that forces everyone to actually deal in an intellectually honest capacity, which has not happened in far too long.
I want to ask you about Elon Musk, because, of course, your company, 1789, deeply invested in many of Elon's companies. I mean, speaking of mediation, have you guys played a role in, we've seen the relationship between the president and Elon Musk go up and down. Have you guys sort of played a role in bringing that bromance back together?
I think without question we got to know Elon very intimately during the campaign and the transition process, maintained those relationships. I could get into the backstory of it, but it doesn't really matter. It was largely a manufactured crisis, and you also have two personalities. People often ask me, how is it with your father? I'm like, well, imagine dealing with one Donald Trump, now I have to deal with two. I mean, they're very similar that way. So it created some headaches, but the reality is, they're both very much aligned. They're on message with what we want to do for our country, with what we want to do for freedom of speech, and so much. I think Elon did incredible things with Twitter. I mean, really allowed the democratization of truth and freedom and free speech to occur, and that was something that was a true threat in America right now. When you look at what Elon's done in terms of his companies, I mean, it's a generational talent, a generational level of genius, and my father understands and respects that, and so it's great to see that going forward now. I mean, this is someone who is changing not just the face of freedom of speech, but the face of science and technology, advancing America's interest, and I think that's fundamentally important. We have to protect our geniuses.
He's back in the fold.
100%.
He's the Thomas Edison of our time. If you look at the companies, we're invested in his entire portfolio. Every single one really falls neatly into our thesis. SpaceX, for example, which, by the way, just announced an $800 billion valuation, which makes it the most valuable private company in America and therefore the world, has probably the greatest consumer product that anyone's ever used, which is Starlink. I'm not sure if you've used it, but you can basically have a flying office now thanks to that. But again, in the case of SpaceX, what you had is you had our government and NASA falling down, and you had a private sector solution to keep the space program afloat, which was SpaceX. And in the same way, as Don pointed out, I think he deserves an enormous amount of credit during a very dark period that I alluded to earlier for keeping free speech alive in America that was under threat when he acquired X or Twitter. That was a huge, huge thing he did, and that's why we're always going to be a supporter of him and his companies.
We've got 3 years left of the Trump administration. What can we expect?
I think a lot. The great irony was it actually felt very good in the last, 24 hours that I've been here. The amount of leaders in this room who have come up to me, they may not say it on a public stage. I understand that gets you some criticism perhaps, but have come up and said, we have 3 years to act. They all get it. They understand that there is a chance that you fall back into the old ways, that everyone that came up to me, even at dinner last night from all over the world, this is the greatest opportunity we've had to reset sort of the global discourse, to be able to effectuate actual change, because they understand that my father is a guy that can get things done. He's perhaps the only one that could get some of these people to a table, effectuate real peace, effectuate real trade, create something that's beneficial for the world. The reality is this: economically or otherwise, a rising tide lifts all boats. If these nations, whether it's Qatar, others in the GCC, are working with the United States, hopefully bringing in Europe, which has its own problems, and that's been a consistent theme throughout the last few months of me speaking at conferences, is what the hell's going on in Europe. But he's the one guy that can do it, and to see world leaders from all over the place understand that and recognize it, I think is a great opportunity, not again just for the United States, but for the world. They understand he's the guy, and it was really heartwarming to see literally dozens of people. This is a 3-year window. This is you know, a window that we'll perhaps never have again to reset things for the good of the world, both business and politically.
I was going to just say, you know, we had a conversation last night with a very smart individual here, and he basically said there are 4 things that you look for a great country. One is you have to have extremely strong leadership. You have to have innovative technology, a strong military, and access to cheap energy. The United States right now has all 4 of those, which makes time of the essence. But I also think it's a segue into what you were about to ask also, which is the relationship with this region. Right now, we're mostly focused on the battle for artificial intelligence in the private sector, and there are 2 areas that are going to be most starved. That's access to capital and access to cheap energy. In particular the case of the Gulf, but even Qatar more specifically with natural gas and capital, they're going to have a big role to play. And I think that's really, if I have to make any point, is, you know, the United States for a long period of time, maybe through complacency or idiocy, however you want to call it, had an idealistic foreign policy. That does not work, and we've seen that time and time over again. Donald Trump has implemented a pragmatic foreign policy, and that kind of transactional perspective gives the opportunity, particularly for this region, to become real partners of the United States.
Is he likely to run again?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Is he likely to run again?
Well, we'll see what happens then. But you know, you never know. I never count him out for anything. But it is funny to watch the leftist heads explode every time he brings it up. So perhaps he's just doing a little bit of trolling. But again, he's the most unpredictable person probably in the history of politics, which is why he's able to get something done. And so I guess we'll have to see.
Don, Omeed, thank you both so much.
Thank you.